Hello everyone, welcome along to another Live on Air. It's my great pleasure to have with me the Rev Richard Lawrence, who's a Presbyterian minister, who currently teaches in Wintec, teaches English, I think, or academic English. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Richard.
Well, I was born and raised in Christchurch. I studied for the ministry of the Presbyterian Church in the mid-1970s. Then went on to have a very interesting year in Birmingham in England and Richmond, Virginia with postgraduate study, and came back to parish ministry in Picton and then Johnsonville Union Church in Wellington and then St Andrews Hamilton. And it was while I was at St Andrews Hamilton that I went back to university and did a degree in linguistics and subsequently got a job at Wintec, which is where I am now.
It was during the 1970s that you became very interested in ecology, which is really part of what we want to talk about today. And the Methodist and Presbyterian Church's Joint Council for Missions sent you to Rio de Janeiro to a great big conference on climate change. Now, when was that and what was it all about?
Well, that theme of ecology really emerged in the 1980s when I was in parish ministry in Picton, and it's hard for us to go back to the 1980s now and see the world as it was then, but in those days the terms climate change and global warming were new. They were new for most people. They were new, and certainly for people in the church they were new, but they were coming through, especially the World Council of Churches, influenced by people like Prime Minister Brundtland of Norway, and others were raising the theme of the potential threat to the environment from global warming in the mid to late 1980s. So I was sent to a conference in 1990 on justice, peace and the integrity of creation. That was in Seoul, Korea. And as a result of that, I came back to New Zealand better equipped to, in those days, I hope it doesn't sound patronising, but it was really to educate, because people really had not heard of the term climate change and global warming and didn't really know what they were referring to. So a lot of the work in the late 1980s was simply raising the issue of climate change and global warming and drawing on resources from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which made its first report, I believe, in the late 1980s and early 90s. And as a result of that kind of ferment coming through the World Council of Churches, I was fortunate enough to go to the Rio de Janeiro, the Earth Summit, as it was there. Well, actually, it was a World Council of Churches conference alongside the Earth Summit.
One of the things, Richard, that really impressed me, because I was in parish ministry initially in sort of the Manawatu area and then into Timaru, and it was at that stage I was starting to read some of your reports that were coming out, and the idea of how we were polluting the environment was really to the fore in a lot of your thinking. I mean, not just in terms of what we were doing to the atmosphere, but what we were doing to a lot of other things. And I thought at the time those were seminal pieces of information that churches actually worked with in a very intense kind of way. Well, I know that I did, and it had a huge impact. How do you feel about it now? Do you see, I mean, climate change is on everyone's lips, so it's moved from something that was fringe, if you like, to something that's central. But are we doing the same kind of work that we were doing back then in the 90s?
I think the answer to that is no. And in those early days, the church had a real role in simply presenting the issues, as you say, and articulating the issues, which were that the whole of the world's environment was now threatened by human activity. That was a new thought, that human activity was posing this kind of threat, particularly the emissions of greenhouse gases. So in those days, I think the church had a kind of consciousness-raising role. But now, as you said, it's quite common to pick up the newspaper and see an article about climate change. And actually, we have a minister for climate change now, and and so the issue is much more in the public arena. We have a Green Party, we have conventions that we've signed as a nation, and there's a wide public consciousness of the issue of climate change, and that, I think, for the church really poses a new question about the role of the church. Since the role is no longer consciousness raising, that's happened. What is the role of the church now? And so the issues have become rather more complex, perhaps, for the church at the very time when the church is, to a certain extent, I think, retreating from public interaction.
From that kind of engagement.
Yes.
I've wondered for a number of years how churches, congregations are smaller, they tend to be more diverse today than they were sort of 20, 30, 40 years ago. Within that diversity, there's not the same sense of urgency that we were really polluting the planet. That I think there was a real urgency.
Yes.
And that has become blunted because, as you rightly say, there's a whole ministry devoted to this now. There's a whole nationwide effort. And I think churches have become complacent about potentially what they could do.
Right.
How do you feel about that?
I think that's true, but I think the church has a very strong role, and it may not be at a national level so clearly as it was when I knew that ministers in Wellington literally spoke to MPs over the fence sometimes, or in the street, and churches. I remember a large petition that was presented to Simon Upton in the late 1980s. So that kind of national movement, I don't see that we have the structures in place to be able to do that as effectively. But we still have parishes, and parishes are set in different communities and in our society. And I think parishes can have a very distinct role as prophetic communities within their community in terms of ecology, by looking at the land in which they live and worship, by looking at the history of that land, and understanding the history in terms of Maori-Pākehā relations, and in terms of ecology. Perhaps parishes could be taking more responsibility for the areas in which they are placed.
There have been
with
some
a prophetic lifestyle, I might say.
Yes, and I think there have been some parishes that have done this magnificently over the years. I think some Methodist and Presbyterian parishes in Dunedin took responsibility for keeping the Kaikarai stream clean, and they've worked at that. I can think of church people down in Riverton who've done sort of quite magnificent work at and in terms of preserving old species of fruit trees and vegetables, as well as taking responsibility for environmental awareness. But once you come up into urban Auckland, which is the patch that I know best, I don't really see churches taking any kind of responsibility. When I think of the way in which so many individuals are saying, look, we could put in solar panels, we could do kinds of things that start to look at generating our own power. And most churches have a huge roof area that could support solar panels.
Exactly.
There are a whole lot of things that they could do within their own building that might have a bit of an impact.
Yes.
But Richard, in a more general sense, do you feel that since you were in parish ministry, and Presbyterians and Methodists at that stage not only were highly ecumenical and committed to one another's causes, they were also very prophetic in a way that I suspect we don't see either church now, or any churches really standing up in the political scene at all. Do you get a sense of...
I think that's true from my experience, and I hope I'm not being unfair, but I see a retreat from that public interface. There are notable exceptions, of course, and I want to say that there are exceptions, but mainly I see a kind of crisis of confidence that results in church people withdrawing in order to somehow consolidate their own life, perhaps as an institution.
That they've become more interested in how do we maintain, how do we actually continue to exist, how do we survive, has become the chief mode of operation for churches.
That's been my experience largely in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
And it's a great pity, because I think the church, when it takes on a role of being prophetic and being in the public for the country, for creation, that's when it finds its identity truly, I think. And when it becomes defensive and inward looking, it ceases so much to be the church of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I think that's very, very true. Well, look, thank you very much for devoting your time to coming and talking to Live On Air today. Sure. This is the second in a little mini-series over a number of months. Our first one was looking at Tiri-Tiri-Matangi and the conservation efforts that are going on there. This one is trying to raise awareness of the issues all over again for the churches, and I hope that we're able to come together and see whether we've made some progress in one or two areas in a few months' time.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, David.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.